You know me. I'd rather get the bombshell out of the way early. The game scored a net negative on the golden number. Go ahead, attack, hate, vitriol. I get it. I do, actually, especially in this case. I tried to look into some behind-the-scenes stuff for this game, and I found a frustratingly small amount of information. I was able to find a few things, dates especially, but makings of, or interviews, or discussions, or any of that stuff, or the code, or any of that. Nothing. In fact, a lot of what I had to find out was a little bit reverse engineered, too. But let's look at what we did find out, shall we? One of the things we know is that Sony wasn't really expecting the PlayStation 1 to be the smash hit that it was. And pretty much the moment they realized the gold mine they were sitting on, Sony went hard onto the Sony PlayStation. And they tried to throw money and time and studios at as many different games as they could to try and get their own little stake in expanding it. So that's point number one. Point number two, we know for total certainty that there are at least 2 games that they had worked on by second-party developers, specifically that they could then own and, use in order to expand their space into a very specific territory within gaming, JRPGs. We know this because Final Fantasy VII was a smash hit that effectively no one predicted. Now, I've talked about FF7 and its impact on gaming as an industry as well as culturally many times. But the only relevance here is that they looked at that and was like, oh, okay, let's do that. And so we got 2 games, Legend of Dragoon and Legend of Legaia. Cool. Now the final tidbit here is that this game was almost assuredly rushed. I don't have hard evidence of that, I should probably mention. What I do know is that this game was racing the clock against another game which was coming out. In fact, this game did beat that game by 4 months, Final Fantasy VIII. I also know that that's just kind of how gaming was, and arguably still is in many companies. But for those of you who have never really studied the history of gaming, especially in the mid to late 90s and in the early aughts, crunch and rushed development time was the norm, not an outlier. So even good games came about as a result of people staying up late, sleeping in the office, and having more coffee than naps. So all of these, hang on, I got one more thing. I'm pretty sure that most of the people who worked on this game, this was their first game, the first time they'd worked on either a video game in general or this particular type of game, a JRPG, in specific. From all of these points, some of which are conjecture, some of which are fact, we're able to get a bit of a picture of what's going on here. We've actually discussed this a lot lately because this just keeps coming up in the miscellaneous block. We've discussed the concept of a first game. Now, a first game is when a particular studio, usually a particular dev team, sits down and says, we want to make X. It's not necessarily the first game in a franchise or the first game on a console, but it's usually the first game on within that particular space. For example, you could argue that Mass Effect 1 was the first game of Mass Effect, and you'd be wrong. The first game of Mass Effect would be Baldur's Gate 1. If you want to argue that, the more recent one would be Neverwinter Nights 1. And you get the general concept, right? So it was their first time trying this new thing, and 9 times out of 10, probably honestly 99 times out of 100, first games tend to suck. Right? I mean, they're new at it. Now, hang on. There's one other proviso I've been keeping to myself about this, because this is a first game that was probably rushed, that was being pushed into a development space in order to try and capture this thing, so probably had some good financial backing, and it does show. There's some good graphics, which was something highly valued at the time, some good CGI effects, etc., etc. But they needed it to be a big competitor to the Final Fantasies, which means it needed to be long. I'll talk about that in a second. And well, this was relatively early in the PlayStation's history, as a console. And there's one inevitable truth that every console across every generation has had. The first couple of games for a console tend to just not be as good because they're the first few games for a console. I mean, look at early NES versus late NES, early PlayStation 1 versus late PlayStation 1, early Xbox versus late Xbox. This is a universal. They just don't know how to use or what to use, or maybe the tools don't exist, or maybe the engines don't exist, or the support doesn't exist, or even just the knowledge base. As time goes on, people get more skilled with something, and so early console development tends to be rough, pretty much no matter what. And then we have one final item to add to the mix. This was the awkward gap in gaming. A lot of people had spent a lot of time, arguably since, like the Amiga, but definitely since the 70s, figuring out how to do sprite-based games. People had drifted into the 3D space. We had vector graphics, and we had certain other types of 3D, especially in the PC market. But this is the early 3D era. This is true for PC games, but also for things like the PlayStation 1 and the N64. And if there's a universal truth, it's that we were still figuring out how to do that. So early 3D games tend to have their own foibles, not because they look bad or because they don't have amazing graphics, but because they were literally using new engines, new hardware, and new concepts, which nobody really knew yet because it was a new thing, right? All of these is essentially my reason for why I think this game scored as badly as it did. All of this is the explanation, the why. Why is important for a golden number, because if the game just sucks, it sucks. This game does not just suck. Quite the contrary. I've had several people tell me not just what they like about, or that they like this game, but what they like about it. And ironically, I agree almost universally. Almost every person I've talked to, and by the way, I ask you too, if you feel like adding to the comments, every person I've asked, what do you like about this game? Everything they've said is something I agree with. Problem is everything else. Let me give you my back-of-the-box quote, something people have been asking me to do more often lately. So here's my back-of-the-box quote. This is 10 hours of a good game inside of 40 hours of a game. One of the concepts that is still true to this very day in game design is padding. Padding, God, I fight against padding, and I have fought against padding for literal decades. It's going back as far as the SNES era, which is when I first really started noticing it. Although NES games had padding too, I just didn't notice back then. Padding is exactly what it sounds like. Now let's be clear. Padding is bad. Now, the way I explain that is the terminology, right? If I say padding, what I mean is elongating a game in a bad way. There are ways to stretch out your game, to add time to a game in a good way, in a way that adds to it, that actually adds flavor, or tone, or gameplay, or replayability, or whatever, right? Padding is when you do that improperly. Padding is when you are padding out the runtime, just trying to make it longer without actually improving it any. And in the process, what you do is you diminish the entire work. Now, some of this padding is almost unavoidable. Almost every single animation has to actually be done in this game. The summons, the enemy attacks, the enemy movements, and every martial arts art that you actually do has its own animation, several of which have slowdown. When we got to the end of Act 2 of 4 in this game, there was an Act 2 boss. I don't even remember his name because it doesn't matter. That fight took us 56 minutes to get through. Wasn't a hard fight, by the way. I mean, we did die twice, but then I locked down the strategy and was able to figure it out pretty effortlessly. The problem is the animations take so long that boss fights take forever. All of them do. But hang on, there's another proviso there, because the boss fights also have way too much health. The worst boss fights in the entire game for me were the Delilah's trio, because in addition to having all the problems every other boss fight had in the game, they had one other critical flaw to them. They were boring. Each of those boss fights can be explained in a very, very simple way. They attack, they use their special. Like clockwork. Now, on the one hand, this makes it predictable, which means it kind of works in the system's favor, which I'll talk about in a minute. But on the other hand, it makes it very predictable. And it means every 3 rounds, you have to watch that cutscene fully play out over and over and over. You want to guess how long those 3 fights took us? I made it a guessing game at a certain point. And at a certain point, I started using the fast forward button because I was freaking sick of it. This game is actually a lot shorter than it probably should be because of that. But I had to do that because otherwise I would drill a hole in my head for how long everything takes and how long the fights are. This is also true with the trash mobs. The trash mobs also have way too much health. And that's in addition to other problems, like the fact that the enemies give way too little money. This is something I don't talk about. I've actually studied RPG design for literal decades at this point. It feels weird to say that, right? I've been studying RPG design so long that my study of RPG design has already finished college. That's a weird thought. Anyways, so one of the things I don't talk about often because the overwhelming majority of games either don't really do much with it or are actually properly designed is itemization in currency, the economy of the game. Let me give you an extremely bare bones example. You're at the beginning of the game. You walk out of town, you walk around, you get into a fight, right? You, the developer, have the ability to decide how much money that fight gives. And you have the ability to decide how much the inn costs and how much healing items cost. Usually the inn is cheaper for some reason or another, probably because you have to go back to there to do it, whereas an item is something you can pop in the dungeon. So that's what you're paying. You're paying for the convenience and the modularity of it. Okay, that makes sense. The basic healing item in this game costs 100 gold. The fights at the beginning of the game give you 11 gold. Do you see the problem here? Here's the really funny thing. That never stopped being true. For the entire playthrough of the game, I was consistently, substantially behind the money curve. The only defense that can be leveled to that, of course, is go grind. But if your argument is go grind, then you've lost that argument, because that's not how that works. So, okay, the game is designed around grinding, right? Not really. I never really fell behind the level curve sufficient to actually require grinding, with one notable exception right at the end of the game. So, for the most of the game, the power progression curve and the difficulty curve were actually pretty smooth. Long and boring, but doable. For the most part, you could out-strategize your way through a fight and not have to run into a stat wall. That's actually good design. And I bring that up because even though we're kind of talking about negatives for the game right now, I have to mention that the thing that weirds me out the most about Legend of Legaia is that it's as good as it is. A lot of RPGs, especially in the early SNES era, and especially in the early PS1 era, have a lot of typical problems. There are very few exceptions to these typical problems. And they all have, it's all too grindy, or it's way too punishing on the encounter design, or maybe they're way too stingy with the items they give, or whatever. You know what I'm talking about, right? There's the typical early JRPG problems. Basically, none of those are here. All of the equipment and items that I needed and used for a huge portion of the game were just available in the dungeons. There was actually good presentation and, placement and utilization of which items were placed where within the dungeons, and which dropped off the bosses. The bosses themselves also gave a huge chunk of gold, which was always enough to get a little bit further up in the leg up. And the experience gain was pretty smooth throughout as well. I never felt particularly behind on levels, except for, again, towards the end of the game. So it wasn't really that issue. It's weird. But then I'm talking about padding. So we talked about padding in animations. We talked about padding in gold, and we talked about padding in with regards to boss HP. But the other thing, too, is just moving around is slow. Just slow. And the dungeons are long. Not interesting, not fun, not engaging. There's nothing about them other than, in most cases, being an occasional branch to go down a dead end and another way. And it's all hallways. Everyone complains about FF10, FF13. No. This is a hallway dungeon game. There's a lot of hallways in these games. And they're long. Long hallways leading to multiple encounters, which have long animations and too much health in the enemies. And then at the end, you fight a boss with long animations while having a huge amount of health. And you can see why the game just stretches itself out to literally being and I meant what I said earlier. I would say this is quadruple the length it actually needs to be. I stand by what I said. If this was about a 10-hour JRPG, it would be a pretty tight experience. And the reasons why are because even though the dungeon design is not good, it's almost universally bad. There are a couple of exceptions to that. The core combat system is really good. Check this out, okay? So, if I said to you right now, Legend of Legaia has good combat, most people would probably just start nodding. But I've never heard anyone go in depth at any level of how well designed this is. So check this out. I know I just said that. You go into combat and you have, first of all, a very intuitive control scheme. You also have good general interface design, good general HUD design, and good shortcutting and quality of life features. They clearly have learned several of their lessons from let's be honest, Final Fantasy VII, which also had a pretty good quality of life features. In fact, FF7 and FF6, to this very day, have the best quality of life features and convenience features in terms of controlling the game of every FF that I've ever played. Shrug. So, you have good overall design on that. Cool. And you pop into combat and you say, I want to attack. Okay. Well, you've got this bar you can fill up with, say, 3 or 4. We'll say 4. 4 different actions. Excuse me. I'm having issues because my throat's killing me. I've been talking all day. What do you want from me? 4 actions. You can do upper, lower, right arm, left arm. Boom, 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 boom. And you can do those in any combination. Now, that's already kind of cool. Then you've got the arts system. So when you do specific combos, you've seen Street Fighter, you know how combos work, then you actually have up a specific combo, so you do punch, punch, and then a special move which has more attack, and in the case of the hyper arts, actually adds some elemental damage to it. Okay, that's pretty cool. As that art bar expands, you can add more and more and more until actually you get up to 9 is the max I ever got to. So you have 9 different actions you can string together to do whatever. That's extremely cool. And you've got your basic arts, your hyper arts, which you get from books, your super arts, which you get just by knowing them and doing them, and your mystic art, which you get by having the 9 bar. All of that's very cool. But hang on, check this out. It's 3 times I've said that now. I'm tired too, I'm sorry. This game has really been dragging on me because of how just long and sloggy it is. I am sorry. I apologize. I just really like this feature. So, 2 arms, up and bottom, right? Okay. Well, the up and bottom are affected by your boots. That increases your attack power on those attacks. You've got a weapon, which increases one of your hands. I think it's the right. I actually don't remember. It's left on the thing. It's left on the D-pad. And you've got another arm, and this is affected by your Raw Seru, and what level that is. So in other words, you have 3 separate forms of attack power affecting how much damage your 4 hits do. And you generally are going to know what each of those are because you know what your equipment setup is. Okay, that's cool. Then we add on to that the fact that each of those will specifically hit a range. Basically top, middle, bottom. Middle will hit everything. Nothing can dodge middle. But you have flying enemies which will avoid bottom, and ground-based enemies which will avoid top. And you could tell all of this instantly, just glancing at the enemy, like, okay, well, that's going to avoid this kind of attack. So, at a glance, you can know what kind of attacks you can do, how many you can chain into what, which attack power you've got where, and which the enemy will dodge. And you can instantly and intuitively say, okay, that's a slime. I want to primarily do low and middle attacks, so we'll go left, left, down, left. We're only going to put the one down in there because I've got an art that'll be improved by doing that one down. So I'll do mostly side damage because I have the highly superior actually, that would be my weapon. I have a really good weapon, but I don't have good boots. But I want the boot attack in there so I can get my combo in order to get a special art in order to do a little bonus damage instead of just straight up doing the hand damage, right? And all of these little decisions that you make are so immediate and so instantaneous. I'm actually curious how many of you never even thought about it because it is so well designed. That's awesome. It is by far and bar none the best part of the entire game, this system. And it even works within itself. It's got some layers of complexity to it. So each of those attacks takes AP. You gain, and the arts also separately take AP. So you have to consider your bar, your resource bar. But as you take damage, and something else, I forget the second thing, and you can also use a spirit ability to regain AP in order to be able to do things. Spirit ability doesn't just give you AP back, though. It also increases your defense by a huge amount and gives you an additional attack you can do. So instead of 4, now you have 5 slots you can do. And that one tiny change means you have been given a fairly large amount of tactical choice in every combat. It's like, oh, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fight this and fight this, but then I've got that big guy over there. So I'm going to defend. Well, I'll get that up. The defense is going to refill my AP from having fought those 2 guys. And now with that defense, I've got 5 attacks. I'm going to do this combo, which takes up 2 of them, and then 2 side attacks because that's my highest damaging weapon. Boom, boom, boom. Done. Great system. Absolutely great system. I would praise it even more if it had the other things that balance it out. What is it that made Doom really, really good? Trick question. If you give any one single answer, you are wrong, and that's the point. What made Doom good was many things. Doom had good itemization in what items dropped where, which enemies dropped which ammo, and where you could get which weapons. Doom had good encounter design, deciding which enemies you can encounter when, in what combination, to increase and generally design the thing, despite having a relatively small number of enemies. Speaking of which, Doom had good enemy design, so that each enemy varied not just in what they did and how much HP they had or how much damage they did, but in how they attacked you and how they were weak to what. Doom also had great arena design, so you would always have an interesting place to actually fight the enemies in question. Doom had all of the above. That's what made Doom so damn good. And that leads us back to this game. This is a problem I've brought up many times recently. In fact, this is the third game in the last month that I've brought up this concept in. You can have one really cool concept, but if you don't have the other aspects of gameplay supporting it, it just falls apart. So this game has really, really cool, excellent, in-depth, complex game design when it comes to its combat. What it does not have is good enemy design. What it does not have is good encounter design. What it does not have is the boss design it needs to have in order to support these things. If it had that, I would be substantially more positive about this game. Instead, it reached a certain point where I was just kind of tired of fighting the same enemies over and over, who barely varied in terms of how you would push through them. Now, there's admittedly one other thing the game does do very right. Actually, two things. So, first of all, you can defeat enemies, certain enemies, specifically Seru enemies, and gain them as a spell. The spell animations take forever. Padding, you get it. But in addition to that, those spells are very useful. Almost every spell in the game is useful to some extent or another. We've got our Fire Boy, who does good with fire spells, Wind Lady, and Lightning Boy. But really, Gala is an excellent mage. I actually turned him into a full tilt mage in my playthrough, and it worked out extraordinarily well. He was the healer, and getting the heals on him was extraordinarily useful. Those spells are actually pretty well designed. Despite the long animation time, they are relatively costly, but there's ways to mitigate that, and they are very useful. They tend to do either lots of damage or lots of healing. So, they're useful. They're not just like plinking spells, and they're not overpriced. And they're actually pretty well balanced, is my overall point. So that's good. Another good element of it. You can also level them simply by using them, right? No, actually, I looked this up. Apparently, using them doesn't universally level them. The way it works is, if you use a spell, like an offensive spell, the percentage of damage it does versus the health of the enemy it kills changes how much experience it gets, from 1 to 12, I believe it was. And when you reach 537 experience, you're at level 9. And you can go all the way from 1 to 9. And obviously, you don't just jump to 9. You level up, but you get the point. So you can level those up, and as they level, they do more damage, which of course increases the experience they get. And it also does mean that leveling them in lower level areas is probably the better option, but let's not go into that. Point is, you can level your spells, and they usually don't just do more damage, but they also usually have some additional effect. Like most of the offensive spells have a debuff associated with them. Most of the heal spells have a cleanse associated with them. I'm pretty sure, I wasn't able to verify this, but I'm pretty sure Spoon actually has a res component attached to it once it hits level 9. Even if it doesn't, obviously there's other ways to res. Speaking of which, the Phoenixes actually heal you to some decent amount of health. Think about how many years it took Final Fantasy to figure that one out. How many of you ever played a JRPG and you're like, all right, Phoenix down, and they get up at 1 health, or 5, or 3, or whatever. And they're like, all right, I'm going to go. And then something sneezes on them, and they're dead instantly. Just, hate that crap. And this, they're actually rezzed with a fairly decent chunk of health. More good design. You also gain the accessories. Let's call these what these are. These are straight-up relics, straight out of Final Fantasy 6 and 7. Not really digging. There's worse JRPGs to copy than FF6 and FF7. But they're good. They're not just stats. There are stats ones, but there's also mutator ones. And there's also ones that can change your strategy. There's not a lot of character customization in this game. But what there is a lot of how do you want your character to fight, which boils down almost entirely to how you set them up. I had Noah set up with the thing so she used only half of her AP, and she also gained back more AP, and also her arts hit like a truck. She was my damage dealer. In multiple boss fights, she was actually the only one doing any damage because she hit for so much harder. I'm talking she would hit for 5,000. The other party members would hit for 600. That's how much more. Anyways, and of course I already told you I set Gel up as a healer, so he had a thing which gained his mana back every turn, and he had a thing which made his spells cost less. And you get the idea. There's all sorts of the usual stuff, but it's good stuff. And that's all good. And I guess that's actually all I got on the gameplay axis. There's a lot of good design here and a lot of bad design here. And I find myself wondering how much of this would have been fixed if the game... I don't want to say it had a mandate to be as long as it is, but it totally had a mandate to be as long as it is. I don't know that for total certainty, but literally, without exaggerating, multiple RPGs, not only back in the 90s, but today, come out by saying it's this long as a selling point. 70-hour RPG. You know what I'm talking about. I guarantee you they padded this one out on purpose. So now you want me to talk about the story. Let's go and give the spoiler warning. 3. So, I have very little to say about the story. I know that's weird, talking about an RPG and the fact that the game scored better on the narrative than on the gameplay axis, but honestly, while the gameplay design in this game is fascinating, the story isn't really there. So check me on this, alright? You start off the game, and you find out a lot of things very quickly and efficiently. The intro is excellent. You're dropped into a village, it's attacked, but you manage to fight back, everything's cool. We're going off on an adventure, we hit the first castle, we do our first dungeon, early game hell happens, and we get to this point where we find out, this is so cool. So there's this mist, and the mist causes the Seru to go crazy. And the Seru will latch onto a person and turn them into a zombie. But here's the weird part. While they're a zombie, they're in stasis. Oh, they're still roaming around, but they're aging, and the requirement for things like food and water and all that stuff goes away. They're effectively magically preserved in the state that they are, unless they are, of course, killed by someone named Gaza, who's a moron. But anyways, so knowing that this is coming, the first kingdom you come onto, Drake Kingdom, not the Drake Kingdom, just Drake Kingdom, they decided to willingly expose themselves to these Seru, put their Seru on, imprison themselves within their castle, and then just wait for the mist to come so they would be preserved until someone would hopefully come along 10 years later, which is what we do, and save them. That all makes perfect sense, is quite logical, and is very well written. It's a great way to add a degree of horror, while at the same time showing that your characters have a brain and that you're treating your plot seriously. I was legitimately impressed by the writing and characterization of all this early game stuff. Then we encounter Noah. Noah is the best character in the game. She's 10 or 12, depending on who you ask. Sources vary because there's obviously some localization issues, and the game literally contradicts itself multiple times, probably because of the aforementioned rushed issue I already mentioned. But Noah is nevertheless awesome. She is adorable and naive, and the game does a very good job of portraying both of those without making her irritating, at least until the end game, at which point she becomes one of the worst party members of the game. Now, Noah is awesome, not just because she's adorable, but because she is a badass, as I think I mentioned earlier. She's the deeps. She's the physical deeps, specifically. She's the one who will punch and kick her way through whatever's in her path, and she will do an excellent job of that. We end up linking up with her. Cool. We go back, we save the Drakes, we go to the monastery, we meet our third party member. He's there. I have nothing to say about him other than that. And we also meet the main villain of the game, badly written guy. I'm not even going to say his name because it is so irrelevant. One of the only story negatives I wrote down early on was for badly written guy. He's one of the biggest examples I can give of the fact that this story feels rushed and disjointed. Because he's clearly a rival type, except he isn't. And he is the cause of a huge amount of horrible things that happen in the game, including everything about the outro. And yet, for no reason. He doesn't really have any motives or anything other than screwing with Gala. And that could work. I've seen that work. A character who is pathetic and ends up being a huge impact on the story can be a very well-written and interesting character. I've played Earthbound. But this is not what this guy is. He is weird. And it feels like they were trying 3 different character archetypes with him and just changed their mind based on which particular segment they were writing, which brings me to my other suspicion. I have a weird feeling that multiple people wrote this game and didn't check notes with each other. It would explain a lot about why the events have very bad story sequencing. In case you've never heard me talk about this, story sequencing is the connective threads between story points. We're over here. we're going to do this, we're taking this boat, the boat goes over here, this happens here, this incident happens, we crash lands, now we're over here. That in between, that's the story sequencing, right? And how story beats connect to each other and we zoom out and we get the whole overall thread of the narrative. That's our story sequencing. I'm actually kind of fascinated by good story sequencing because a really well-written story is one you barely notice as you're jifting and juking through the plot. It's just everything makes so much sense and follows so smoothly from previous events. Bad story sequencing makes you go, why are we doing this now? Something I pointed out a while ago was that Final Fantasy IV, much as I love that game, has pretty bad story sequencing. A lot of events just happen with no real rhyme or reason to them. Same thing in this game. There's a whole lot of just, and then we're going to go here, and then we're going to go here, and here, and here. Then down here, then back up here, then over here. And there's no logic between how these events are connected to each other, with a couple of exceptions. Because every now and again it makes perfect sense. And again, multiple writers theory. So we meet the monks, and that's cool. And this is when the narrative really starts to jump off the deep end, because things just kind of start happening, like I just mentioned. And we start to do a bunch of little private, quiet, local stories. Keeping in mind, that could work. I actually like that idea. Not Valkyria Chronicles. What's the other one? Valkyrie Profile. Lenneth. That's a good example of doing local little stories as a way to progress the plot. Okay, that works. You could also do something like Dragon Quest VII is another example of primarily local plots. So it does that, but only briefly, and then it immediately drifts back to the main plot. But then it goes back to local plots. Then it goes back to the main plot. Okay, sure. And then we meet the big villain of Act 2, the guy I mentioned earlier, who is mentioned once before we go there. And yes, I was talking to everyone. Okay. As good as the time as any to talk about fishing. There's fishing in the game. You can get some of the best gear in the game from fishing. Anyways, thought I'd mention that right about now because the next thing I want to talk about is... I'm being facetious. I apologize. You get to the final area, and then it starts to fall apart really hard. We have a really forced love plot between two people who are idiots. The pimp scene is the best scene in the game. We have weird segments of trying to connect with, like, our family who never was. This is all. Act 3 is also officially when Noah becomes the main character. Check this out. Without hyperbole, there are exactly 4 times in the entire narrative where the main character, Vaughn, is actually relevant to the story. I'm not making that up. Beginning of the game, right? The flashback, or not the flashback, but like our visions of the past, when we take our dreams at Urumai. Okay. Right at the end, in the fake out ending, which is like 20 minutes before the actual ending. I don't even know what the hell they were on about for that. And then finally, in the ending. That's it. Noah is the main character of this game. No arguing this. This isn't a Yuna situation where we're playing the protagonist and Yuna's the main. No, Noah is the main character of this game. In fact, Imperial Star Destroyer had a theory which I completely agree with. It's entirely possible that Noah was the main character in protagonist terms. And they decided for whatever reason, either because of gameplay balance or because they wanted another character they wanted your typical anime hero to put on the box art or whatever, they decided to add Vaughn into existence. And that's why he's so disconnected from everything, whereas Noah is a main character for 2.5 acts. Directly connected, she's the sister of the main villain, and she's also, part of the kingdom that started the Great War, and the mist that came from that, and just all this nonsense, and it's all directly connected to her, and she's the one who's always reacting to and responding to, in every scene, all the actions that are happening in the narrative. She's the main character. She's the protagonist. Vaughn's the errand boy who's over there. I mean, Noah's already carrying the party gameplay-wise, so she might as well carry the plot. But then the game forgets how to write Noah, and she goes from being awesome and naive and adorable to being irritating and repeating everything way too often, to the point I actually had to give the game an empty text negative for how often they would say there was an empty text negative, because every now and again the game would have an empty text negative in the empty text negative. And I sound harsh because I don't know what the hell's going on with this story. I really don't. What's the main villain's plot? Real question. I don't know what the main villain was after. I don't even know what the frickin' rival dude, who isn't a rival, was after. Now, I have a theory, and because it's my job, I'm going to share it with you. But I'm actually curious of your interpretation, because that's all we got is interpretations on what the hell's going on. So they keep talking about the Seru, who are totally not angels, and Teague, who's totally not God, and Rogue, or sometimes the Rogues, who are totally not the devil, and demons. That's kind of my theory in a nutshell. I think that what happened is Rogue was cast down, and so as a consequence decided to start screwing with humans because he's evil, and he's pissed, and either he wanted to use the humans to go after Teague, or he just wanted to mess with them because he is evil. That's it. That's the plot, I think. Again, that's just my interpretation. What does Court have to do with anything? Nothing. He just happened to be someone who was possessed by or interacted with Rogue, which leads to him being evil. Cool. What does Rival Guy have to do with anything? Nothing. He's just a dick. And that's it. I do really like one idea this game has. I was actually even sharing it with my mother, Lorma, because I love the idea of a planet where everyone interacts with Seru, which I haven't explained yet. So Seru are creatures, totally not angels, who you can interact with them and they can grant you superhuman abilities. But I don't just mean like in terms of X-Men. I mean in some cases they can help people to fly, or they can help people to be much stronger than they already were, or faster, or they can help to grow really large and push something, right? And my point for bringing all this up is this society is relatively technologically unadvanced because all of their technology was developed around the Seru. Everything they do, all their military, all their economy, all their infrastructure, all their entertainment, everything we see is something that sits on the basis of using Seru instead of using, a circuit board or steam power or whatever else might exist, right? This is kind of a cool concept, and I actually really wish the game did more with this idea, because not only is it cool, but every time we see it poke in, it's actually awesome. Like the very idea of the tram car, which connects the two continents, which is literally being pushed by a giant Seru, which is being piloted by a dude. That's a cool idea. It also adds some more impact to the ending where, spoilers, all the Seru are going away. So all that technology is going away. Now, this would be further interesting if they kept that good writing, consequent storytelling at the beginning going, because one of the things that is never brought up is how the hell these people have been feeding themselves for 10 years during the apocalypse. There are two towns, Vidna and Seoul, right off the top of my head, where people have been alive and well, okay, they've been alive for the past 10 years and not frozen like everyone else is in most of the other towns. Where are they getting their food and water and plumbing and all the other things that they need? Where are they exist? What are they subsisting off of? Now, I'm not saying that's, something that can't be written. This isn't a Final Fantasy 15 situation. What I mean is it would be interesting to write how they did that. What if they have been living so long off of the Seru, literally harvesting Seru for their meat and using that as a way to try and subsist? Thus, so many, agriculture and economic backbones of the world kind of rest on something that's going away at the end of the game. Now what? I'm not saying that it should end on a downer, quite the contrary. I just think it's an interesting etch-a-sketch situation. That's right. Well, time to figure all this stuff out from scratch, right? I mean, we've got some people, we've got some towns, and, war is not a thing right now, although, honestly, conflict over resources might be a thing within a single generation, depending on how this goes. And there's a lot of ways you can do that, right? There's a lot of cool ideas. During stream, we were talking about a bunch of cool ideas for a proper remake of this game, which I would totally be in favor of, by the way. And one of the things I came up with, because I'm a total dorcas, is the idea of actually having a very basic economic minigame built into the game, where you can, as you free these towns from the mist, they start to interact with you differently, and you can connect them. And as you connect them, that changes which items you can buy at which town and which rewards you can get from them. Maybe it changes which NPCs are in both towns because, they're trading so often. It can actually slowly over time add new items to this list as you keep them traded and they keep expanding their shops. Just some cool ideas like that, right? Keep it basic enough so it doesn't overwhelm the player, but interesting enough so that you have some choices and options in what you want to do and where. And of course, completely optional. You don't have to do any of it. I also liked the idea of kind of removing, make it so that, you've rescued the town, right? Yay, thank you. you now have 400 gratitude points for that town. And so as a consequence, you can go to the shop and just buy stuff for free because they are grateful enough to you. And so you have 400 points of gratitude with this town to work, and everything costs X gratitude, and you get the idea, right? And you can decide what you want to do with that. It's a way to choose your own reward after having saved the town and completed the quest. Just a little idea that occurred to me. Anyways, I guess I don't have anything else to add. This is a game that it makes perfect sense why people like. And I hope you all don't hate me for not liking it. Because while there are some very cool ideas here and some very awesome concepts and a great core combat and a lot of other good game design decisions, it's just too long, and it dragged on me hard. So I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts, as brief as they may be. See you next time.